Mire but Soul. Part 1. It was in the sewers of Paris that Jean Valjean found himself. Further resemblance of Paris with the sea, as in the ocean the diver can disappear. The transition was marvellous. From the very centre of the city, Jean Valjean had gone out of the city, and, in the twinkling of an eye, in the time of lifting a cover and closing it again, he had passed from broad day to complete obscurity, from noon to midnight, from uproar to silence, from the whirl of the thunder to the stagnation of the tomb, and, by a mutation, much more prodigious still than of the Rue Polonceau, from the most extreme peril to the most absolute security. The spring trap of safety had suddenly opened beneath him. Celestial goodness had, in some sort, taken him by treachery, adorable ambuscades of Providence. Only the wounded man did not stir, and Jean Valjean did not know whether what he was carrying away in this grave was alive or dead. His first sensation was blindness. Suddenly he saw nothing more. It seemed to him that also in 1 minute he had become deaf. He heard nothing more. He reached out one hand, then the other, and touched the wall on both sides, and realized that the passage was narrow. He slipped, and realized that the pavement was wet. He advanced 1 foot with precaution, fearing a hole, a pit, some gulf. He made sure the flagging continued. A whiff of fetidness informed him where he was. After a few moments he ceased to be blind. A little light fell from the air-hole through which he had slipped in, and his eye became accustomed to this cave. He had laid Marius upon the ground. He gathered him up. This is again the right word, and replaced him upon his shoulders, and began his journey. He resolutely entered that obscurity. At the end of 50 paces he was obliged to stop. A question presented itself. The passage terminated in another which it met transversely. These 2 roads were offered. Which now should he take? Should he turn to the left or to the right? How guide himself in this black labyrinth? This labyrinth has a clue, its descent. To follow the descent is to go to the river. Jean Valjean understood this at once. He said to himself that he was probably in the sewer of the markets, that if he should choose the left and follow the descent, he would come in less than a quarter of an hour to some mouth upon the Seine, between the Pont au Change and the Pont Neuf. That is to say, he would reappear in broad day in the most populous portion of Paris. He would be seized before getting out. It was better to plunge into the labyrinth, to trust to this darkness, and to rely on Providence for the issue. He chose the right, and went up the ascent. When he had turned the corner of the gallery, the distant gleam of the air-hole disappeared. The curtain of obscurity fell back over him, and he again became blind. He walked forward none the less, as rapidly as he could. Marius' arms were passed about his neck, and his feet hung behind him. He held both arms with one hand, and groped for the wall with the other. Marius' cheek touched his and stuck to it, being bloody. He felt a warm stream which came from Marius, flow over him, and penetrate his clothing. Still, a moist warmth at his ear, which touched the wounded man's mouth, indicated respiration, and consequently life. The passage through which Jean Valjean was now moving was not so small as the first. Jean Valjean walked in it with difficulty. The rains of the previous day had not yet run off, and made a little stream in the centre of the floor, and he was compelled to hug the wall, to keep his feet out of the water. Thus he went on in midnight. He resembled the creatures of night groping in the invisible, and lost underground in the veins of the darkness. He went forward with anxiety but with calmness, seeing nothing, knowing nothing, plunged into chance, that is to say, swallowed up in Providence. Suddenly he was surprised. At the most unexpected moment, without having diverged from a straight line, he discovered that he was no longer rising. The water of the brook struck coming against his heels, instead of upon the tops of his feet. The sewer now descended. What? Would he then soon reach the Seine? This danger was great, but the peril of retreat was still greater. He continued to advance. It was not toward the Seine that he was going. The saddleback, which the topography of Paris forms upon the right bank, empties one of its slopes into the Seine, and the other into the Grand Sewer. He was making his way toward the Belt Sewer. He was on the right road, but he knew nothing of it. At a certain moment, he felt he was getting away from under the Paris which was petrified by the émeute, in which the barricades had suppressed the circulation, and that he was coming beneath the Paris which was alive and normal. He heard suddenly above his head a sound like thunder, distant but continuous. It was the rumbling of the vehicles. Part 2. In the afternoon of the 6th of June, at the brink of the Seine, on the beach of the right bank, a little beyond the bridge of the Invalides, 2 men some distance apart seemed to be observing each other, one avoiding the other. The one who was going before was endeavoring to increase the distance, the one who came behind to lessen it. These two men could not have been easily seen, except from the quay in front, and to him who might have been examined them from that distance, the man who was going forward would have appeared like a bristly creature, tattered and skulking, restless and shivering under a ragged blouse, and the other like a classic and official person, wearing the overcoat of authority, buttoned to the chin. The reader would perhaps recognize these two men if he saw them nearer. The closely buttoned man, perceiving from the shore a fiacre, which was passing on the quay empty, beckoned to the driver. The driver understood, evidently recognized with whom he had to do, turned his horse, and began to follow the two men on the upper part of the quay at a walk. This was not noticed by the equivocal and ragged personage who was in front. The fiacre rolled along the trees of the Champs-Élysées. There could be seen moving above the parapet the bust of the driver, whip in hand. While manoeuvring, each on his side, with an irreproachable strategy, these two men approached a slope of the quay descending to the beach, which at that time allowed the coach drivers coming from Passy to go to the river to water their horses. It seemed probable that the man in the blouse would go up by this slope in order to attempt escape into the Champs-Élysées. To the great surprise of his observer, the man pursued did not take the slope of the watering place. He continued to advance on the beach along the quay. His position was visibly becoming critical. If not to throw himself into the Seine, what was he going to do? It is true that this end of the beach was masked from sight by a mound of rubbish from 6 to 7 feet high, the product of some demolition. But did this man hope to hide with any effect behind this heap of fragments, which the other had only to turn? The expedient would have been puerile. He certainly did not dream of it. The innocence of robbers does not reach this extent. The heap of rubbish made a sort of eminence at the edge of the water, which prolonged like a promontory, as far as the wall of the quay. The man pursued reached this little hill and doubled it, so that he ceased to be seen by the other. The latter, not seeing, was not seen. He took advantage of this to abandon all dissimulation and to walk very rapidly. In a few seconds he came to the mound of rubbish and turned it. There he stopped in amazement. The man whom he was hunting was gone. Total eclipse of the man in the blouse. The beach beyond the mound of rubbish had scarcely a length of 30 yards, then it plunged beneath the water which beat against the wall of the quay. The fugitive could not have thrown himself into the Seine, nor scaled the quay without being seen by him who was following him. What had become of him? The man in the closely buttoned coat walked to the end of the beach, and stopped there a moment, thoughtful, his fists convulsive, his eyes ferreting. Suddenly he slapped his forehead. He had noticed, at the point where the land and the water began, an iron grating, broad and low, arched with a heavy lock and 3 massive hinges. This grating, a sort of door cut into the bottom of the quay, opened upon the river as much as upon the beach. A blackish stream flowed from beneath it. This stream emptied into the Seine. Beyond its heavy rusty bars could be distinguished a sort of corridor, arched and obscure. The man folded his arms and looked at the grating reproachfully. This look not sufficing, he tried to push it. He shook it. It resisted firmly. It was probable that it had just been opened, although no sound had been heard, a single circumstance of the grating so rusty, but it was certain that it had been closed again. That indicated that he before whom this door had just turned had not a hook but a key. This evident fact burst immediately upon the mind of the man who was exerting himself to shake the grating, and forced from him this indignant epithenema. "This is fine, a government key." Then, calming himself immediately, he expressed a whole world of interior ideas by this whiff of monosyllables, accented almost ironically. "Well, well, well, well." This said, hoping in nobody knows what, either to see the man come out or to see others go in, he posted himself in the water behind the heap of rubbish, with the patient rage of a pointer. For its part, the fiacre, which followed all his movements, had halted above him near the parapet. The few passers over the Pont Diana, before going away, turned their heads to look, for a moment, at these two motionless features of the landscape, the man on the beach and the fiacre on the quay. Part 3. Jean Valjean had resumed in his advance, and had not stopped again. This advance became more and more laborious. Jean Valjean was hungry and thirsty especially, and this place, like the sea, is one full of water, where you cannot drink. His strength, which was prodigious, and very little diminished by age, thanks to his chaste and sober life, began to give way notwithstanding. Fatigue grew upon him, and as his strength diminished, the weight of his load increased. Marius, dead perhaps, weighed heavily upon him as inert bodies do. It might have been about 3 o'clock in the afternoon when he arrived at the belt sewer. He was first astonished at this sudden enlargement. He abruptly found himself in the gallery, where his outstretched hands did not reach the two walls, and under an arch which his head did not touch. But there the question returned, to ascend or to descend? He thought that the condition of affairs was urgent, and that he must, at whatever risk, now reach the Seine, in other words, descend. He turned to the left. A little beyond an affluent, which was probably the branching of the Madeleine, he stopped. He was very tired. A large air-hole, probably the vista on the Rue d'Anjou, produced an almost vivid light. Jean Valjean, with the gentleness of movement of a brother for his wounded brother, laid Marius upon the side bank of the sewer. Marius' bloody face appeared under the white gleam from the air-hole, as if at the bottom of a tomb. His eyes were closed, his hair adhered to his temples like brushes dried in red paint. His hands dropped down lifeless, his limbs were cold. There was coagulated blood at the corners of his mouth. A clot of blood had gathered in the tie of his cravat. His shirt was bedded in the living flesh. The cloth of his coat chafed the gaping gashes in the wounds. Jean Valjean, removing the garments with the ends of his fingers, laid his hand upon his breast. The heart still beat. Jean Valjean tore up his shirt, bandaged the wounds as well as he could, and staunched the flowing blood. Then, bending in the twilight over Marius, who was still unconscious and almost lifeless, he looked at him with an inexpressible hatred. In opening Marius' clothes, he had found two things in his pockets: the bread which had been forgotten there since the day previous, and Marius' pocketbook. He ate the bread and opened the pocketbook. On the first page he found the 4 lines written by Marius. They will be remembered. My name is Marius Pontmercy. Carry my corpse to my grandfather's, Monsieur Gillenormand, Rue de Fille de Calvaire, number 6, in the Mire. By the light of the air-hole, Jean Valjean read those lines, and stopped a moment, as if absorbed in himself, repeating in an undertone, Rue de Fille de Calvaire, number 6, Monsieur Gillenormand. He replaced the pocketbook in Marius' pocket. He had eaten. Strength had returned to him. He took Marius on his back again, laid his head carefully upon his right shoulder, and began to descend the sewer. The rumblings of the wagons above his head, from continuous having become intermittent, and then having almost ceased, he concluded that he was under central Paris no longer, and he was approaching some solitary region, in the vicinity of the outer boulevards, or the furthest quays, where there are fewer houses and fewer streets. The sewer has fewer air-holes. The darkness thickened about Jean Valjean. He nonetheless continued to advance, groping in the obscurity. This obscurity suddenly became terrible. Part 4. He felt that he was entering the water, and that he had under his feet pavement no longer but mud. Jean Valjean felt the pavement slipping away under him. He entered into this slime. It was water on the surface, mire at the bottom. He must surely pass through. To retrace his steps was impossible. Marius was expiring, and Jean Valjean exhausted. Where else could he go? Jean Valjean advanced. Moreover, the quagmire appeared not very deep, for a few steps. But in proportion as he advanced, his feet sank in. He very soon had the mire half knee-deep, and water above his knees. He walked on, holding Marius with both arms, as high above the water as he could. The mud now came up to his knees, and the water to his waist. He could no longer turn back. He sank in deeper and deeper. This mire, dense enough for one man's weight, evidently could not bear two. Marius and Jean Valjean would have had a chance of escape separately. Jean Valjean continued to advance, supporting this dying man, who was perhaps a corpse. The water came up to his armpits, and he felt that he was foundering. It was with difficulty that he could move in the depth of the mire in which he was. The density, which was the support, was also the obstacle. He still held Marius up, and with an unparalleled outlay of strength he advanced, but he sank deeper. He now had only his head out of the water, and his arms supporting Marius. There is in the old pictures of the deluge a mother doing thus with her child. He sank still deeper. He threw his face back to escape the water and to be able to breathe. He, who should have seen him in the obscurity, would have thought he saw a mask floating upon the darkness. He dimly perceived Marius' drooping head and livid face above him. He made a desperate effort, and thrust his foot forward. His foot struck something solid, a support. It was time. He rose and writhed, and rooted himself upon this support with a sort of fury. It produced the effect upon him of the first step of a staircase reascending toward life. He ascended this inclined plane, and reached the other end of the quagmire. On coming out of the water, he struck against a stone, and fell upon his knees. This seemed to him fitting, and he remained thus for some time, his soul lost in unspoken prayer to God. He rose shivering, chilled, infected, bending beneath this dying man whom he was dragging on, all dripping with slime, his soul filled with a strange light. Part 5. He resumed his route once more. This supreme effort had exhausted him. His exhaustion was so great that every 3 or 4 steps he was obliged to take breath, and leaned against the wall. Once he had to sit down upon the curb to change Marius' position, and he thought he should stay there. But if his vigour was dead, his energy was not. He rose again. He walked with desperation, almost with rapidity, for 100 paces without raising his head, almost without breathing, then suddenly struck against the wall. He raised his eyes, and at the extremity of the passage, down there before him, far, very far away, he perceived a light. Jean Valjean saw the outlet. A condemned soul who, from the midst of the furnace, should suddenly perceive an exit from Gehenna, would feel what Jean Valjean felt. It would fly frantically, with the stumps of its burned wings, toward the radiant door. Jean Valjean felt exhaustion no more. He felt Marius wait no longer. He found again his knees of steel. He ran rather than walked. Jean Valjean reached the outlet. There he stopped. It was indeed the outlet, but did not let him out. The arch was closed by a strong grating, and the grating which, according to all appearance, rarely turned upon its rusty hinges, was held in its stone frame by a stout lock, which, red with rust, seemed an enormous brick. He could see the keyhole and the strong bolt deeply plunged into the iron staple. The lock was plainly a double lock. It was one of those Bastille locks, with which the old Paris was so lavish. Beyond the grating, the open air, the river, the daylight, the beach, very narrow, but sufficient to get away. The distant quays, Paris, that gulf in which one is so easily lost, the wide horizon, liberty. He distinguished at his right, below him, the bridge of Vienna, and at his left, above, the bridge of the Invalides. The spot would have been propitious for awaiting night and escaping. It was one of the most solitary points in Paris, the beach which fronts on the Gros Caillou. The flies came in and went out through the bars of the grating. It might have been 8:30 in the evening. The day was declining. Jean Valjean laid Marius along the wall on the dry part of the floor, then walked to the grating and clenched the bars with both hands. The shaking was frenzied, the shock nothing. The grating did not stir. Jean Valjean seized the bars one after another, hoping to be able to tear out the least solid one and make a lever of it to lift the door or break the lock. Not a bar yielded. A tiger's teeth are not more solid than their sockets. No lever, no possible purchase. The obstacle was invincible. No means of opening the door. He had only succeeded in escaping into a prison. It was over. All that Jean Valjean had done was useless. Exhaustion ended in abortion. They were both caught in the gloomy and immense web of death, and Jean Valjean felt running over those black threads, trembling in the darkness, the appalling spider. He turned his back to the grating, and dropped upon the pavement, rather prostrate than sitting, beside the yet motionless Marius, and his head sank between his knees. No exit. This was the last drop of anguish. Of whom did he think, in this overwhelming dejection? Neither of himself nor of Marius. He thought of Cosette.